My blood sugar monitor said, "Dangerously high, seek medical attention." But the flight attendant took it and said, "All electronics must be off during takeoff." The device beeped 3 times in rapid succession, the kind of urgent alert that meant my blood glucose was spiking into dangerous territory. 387 mg/dl flashed on the screen in angry red numbers. I needed to inject insulin immediately or risk diabetic ketoacidosis, a condition that could kill me in hours. My hands were already shaking as I reached for my insulin pen, but before I could grab it from my carry-on bag, a flight attendant appeared in the aisle beside my seat. She was maybe 30 years old, with blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. Wearing the standard Navy uniform of Coastal Airways with a name tag that read, Brittany. She pointed at the continuous glucose monitor attached to my arm and said in a voice loud enough for half the cabin to hear, "Sir, all electronic devices must be turned off and stowed during takeoff. That includes medical equipment." I'd been a type 1 diabetic for 18 years, since I was 14 years old, and I'd flown dozens of times with my medical equipment without incident. I knew the rules. Continuous glucose monitors and insulin pumps were explicitly exempted from electronic device restrictions by the FAA because they were medical necessities, not entertainment devices. I tried to explain this to Brittany while my monitor beeped again, now showing 392 and climbing. She cut me off before I could finish my first sentence and said that she'd been working for Coastal Airways for 8 years and she knew the rules better than I did. She held out her hand expectantly, waiting for me to remove the monitor from my arm and hand it over. I told her I couldn't do that removing it would leave me blind to my blood sugar levels during a critical high, and that the device was medically necessary and legally protected. Her expression hardened, and she said if I didn't comply immediately, she'd have the captain return to the gate and I'd be removed from the flight. I was flying from Seattle to Phoenix for my sister Rachel's wedding, which was happening in less than 24 hours. Rachel and I had been close our entire lives, and missing her wedding wasn't an option. I'd already taken 2 days off work from my job as a software engineer at a tech startup, days I couldn't really afford to miss given the tight deadline on our latest project. The flight was completely booked, and the next available seat to Phoenix wasn't until the following afternoon, which would be too late. I was trapped between complying with an ignorant flight attendant's illegal demand or missing my sister's wedding. The monitor beeped again. 401 mean DL. My vision was starting to blur slightly at the edges, the first sign that my blood sugar was climbing into truly dangerous territory. I needed to inject insulin within the next 10 minutes, or I'd start experiencing severe symptoms that could progress to a medical emergency requiring hospitalization. I pulled out my phone to show Brittany the FAA regulations that specifically exempted medical devices from the electronics ban. She didn't even look at my screen before telling me that phones also needed to be turned off, and that she wasn't going to argue with me anymore. 2 other flight attendants had noticed the commotion and were walking down the aisle toward us. One was an older man with gray hair whose name tag read Dennis, and the other was a younger woman named Kimberly. Brittany explained the situation to them in a tone that made me sound like a difficult passenger refusing to follow simple instructions. Dennis looked at my glucose monitor and then at me and said he was sorry, but all electronics had to be off during takeoff. No exceptions. I explained again that continuous glucose monitors were legally exempted medical devices and that I was experiencing a dangerous blood sugar spike that required immediate treatment. Kimberly suggested I could just turn the monitor off during takeoff and turn it back on once we reached cruising altitude, which would only be about 15 minutes. 15 minutes at 401 mg/dl, and rising could be the difference between managing the situation and ending up in a diabetic coma. I tried to explain this, but Brittany interrupted and said if I refused to comply, she was calling the captain. The monitor showed 408 now. My mouth was dry, and I was starting to feel nauseous, both symptoms of hyperglycemia. I asked if I could at least inject insulin before they took my monitor, and Dennis said no because we were about to push back from the gate, and all passengers needed to remain seated with seatbelts fastened. The absurdity of the situation was overwhelming. I was sitting in seat 14C of a commercial aircraft being told I couldn't access my life-saving medication because of a policy that didn't even apply to my medical device. I asked to speak to the captain directly, and Brittany said the captain was busy preparing for takeoff and didn't have time to deal with non-compliant passengers. The plane started moving backward as we pushed away from the gate. My monitor alarmed again, now reading 415 mg/dl. At this level, I was at serious risk of diabetic ketoacidosis, a condition where the body starts breaking down fat for energy because it can't use glucose without insulin, producing toxic ketones that can cause organ failure and death. I'd been hospitalized with DKA once when I was 16, and I remembered the excruciating pain, the confusion, the feeling like my body was eating itself from the inside. I wasn't going to let it happen again, especially not because of some power-tripping flight attendants who didn't understand basic medical equipment regulations. I unbuckled my seatbelt and stood up to reach for my insulin pen in the overhead compartment. Brittany immediately pushed the call button and spoke into her handset, telling the captain there was a passenger refusing to comply with safety regulations and standing during taxi. The plane stopped moving. The captain's voice came over the intercom saying we were returning to the gate due to a passenger safety issue. Everyone in the cabin turned to look at me as the flight attendant stood in the aisle blocking my access to the overhead bin. I tried one more time to explain that I was having a medical emergency and needed to inject insulin immediately, but Dennis said I should have thought about that before refusing to follow crew instructions. The other passengers were starting to mutter complaints about the delay, some of them glaring at me like I was the problem. A man across the aisle said loudly that people who couldn't follow simple rules shouldn't be allowed to fly. I felt my face burning with humiliation and fear as my blood sugar continued climbing. The monitor now showed 423 mmDL. My hands were trembling badly, and I was sweating despite the cool cabin air. I sat back down and tried to stay calm while we taxied back to the gate. Once we were parked, a Coastal Airways supervisor named Patricia Dunn boarded the plane. She was in her 50s with short dark hair and an expression that suggested she'd dealt with difficult passengers many times before. Brittany explained the situation to her in the aisle while I sat listening, and every word out of Brittany's mouth was a distortion of what had actually happened. According to her version, I'd refused to turn off an electronic device, had become belligerent with the crew, and had unbuckled during taxi in violation of federal regulations. I tried to interrupt to give my side, but Patricia held up her hand and told me I'd have my chance to speak. After Brittany finished, Patricia turned to me and asked me to explain. I told her I was a type 1 diabetic experiencing a dangerous high blood sugar level, that my continuous glucose monitor was an FDA-approved medical device legally exempted from FAA electronics restrictions, and that I desperately needed to inject insulin before the situation became life-threatening. Patricia looked at my glucose monitor for a long moment. I could see her reading the display, which now showed 431 mmDL with an upward arrow indicating my blood sugar was still rising rapidly. She asked if I had documentation that the device was medical equipment. I pulled up the manufacturer's website on my phone showing the FDA approval and the FAA exemption letter that I always kept saved for situations exactly like this. She read it carefully and then looked at Brittany with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. She asked Brittany if she'd seen this documentation before demanding I turn off the device. Brittany said she hadn't asked for documentation because the rules were clear that all electronics had to be off during takeoff. Patricia sighed and told me I could keep my monitor on and use my insulin, but that I was being removed from this flight and would need to be rebooked on a later flight as a consequence of causing a disturbance. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I'd done nothing wrong except try to manage a life-threatening medical condition, and I was being punished for it, while the flight attendants who'd violated federal disability laws faced no consequences. I asked Patricia how I was supposed to make it to my sister's wedding if I was removed from the only flight that would get me there on time. She said that wasn't her problem, and that Coastal Airways took safety very seriously, which apparently meant removing diabetic passengers for using their medical equipment. I asked to speak to someone higher in the company hierarchy, and she said I could file a complaint through their website, but the decision to remove me from the flight was final. 2 airport security officers appeared in the cabin doorway, and Patricia gestured for me to gather my belongings. My monitor showed 438 mmDL. I was feeling dizzy now, and my stomach was cramping, the nausea getting worse by the minute. I grabbed my carry-on bag and my insulin pen, and finally, was able to inject the dose I'd needed 30 minutes earlier. The other passengers watched in silence as I walked down the aisle escorted by security, like I was some kind of criminal. One woman actually pulled her purse closer as I passed, as if I might try to steal it. I could feel tears of frustration burning behind my eyes, but I refused to cry in front of these people who'd treated me like a problem to be removed, rather than a passenger with a legitimate medical need. The security officers were actually kind once we were off the plane. The older one, Officer Raymond Taylor, asked if I was okay and whether I needed medical attention. I told him my blood sugar was dangerously high, but that I'd just injected insulin and should start coming down within the hour. He offered to call paramedics, but I declined, knowing that a trip to the emergency room would definitely make me miss the wedding. Officer Taylor walked with me back to the gate area and asked what had happened on the plane. I explained the entire situation while checking my glucose monitor obsessively. The number had peaked at 445 mmDL, high enough that I was genuinely concerned about DKA, but it was finally starting to drift downward as the insulin took effect. Officer Taylor said it sounded like the flight crew had screwed up badly and suggested I document everything while it was fresh in my mind. He gave me his card with his incident report number and said I might need it for a complaint or legal action. I thanked him and sat down in the empty gate area, my hands still shaking from the adrenaline and the high blood sugar. The flight I'd been removed from took off 20 minutes later. I watched it taxi past the windows and felt a crushing sense of defeat wash over me. I'd been managing type 1 diabetes successfully for nearly 2 decades, and in all that time, I'd never been made to feel so helpless and humiliated. I called Rachel from the gate and tried to explain what had happened. She was in the final throes of wedding preparation chaos, and I could hear people talking in the background as she asked me to repeat everything twice before it sank in. She started crying and asking how an airline could do this, whether it was legal, what we were supposed to do now. I told her I was trying to get rebooked on another flight, but it wasn't looking good. She said she'd pay for a last-minute ticket on any airline if it would get me there, but when I checked all the carriers, everything was either sold out or wouldn't arrive until after the ceremony. The rehearsal dinner was that evening, and the wedding was at 2 the next afternoon. Even if I could get a flight tomorrow morning, I'd be cutting it impossibly close and would miss all the pre-wedding events Rachel had planned. I could hear her trying not to sob as she said it was okay, that she understood, that my health was more important. But I knew how much it meant to her to have me there, and the guilt was crushing. I went to the Coastal Airways customer service desk, where a tired-looking woman named Angela Barnes tried to help me get rebooked. She pulled up my reservation, and her expression changed as she read something on her screen. She said my ticket had been flagged as a safety removal, and that Coastal Airways policy prohibited rebooking passengers who'd been removed from flights for safety violations within 72 hours. I asked how using medically necessary equipment qualified as a safety violation, and she said she didn't make the policies. She just followed them. I asked to speak to a supervisor, and she said the supervisor would tell me the same thing. I asked if I could purchase a new ticket under a different reservation, and she said that since I was in the system as a removed passenger, I wouldn't be allowed to purchase any Coastal Airways tickets until the safety removal was reviewed and cleared, which could take 3 to 5 business days. The absurdity was staggering. I'd been removed from a flight for the crime of being diabetic, and now I was being treated like I'd threatened the crew or tried to breach the cockpit. Angela could see my frustration and quietly suggested I might have legal recourse given that the removal was related to a medical disability. She said she wasn't supposed to say this, but she'd seen the incident report, and it was pretty clear the flight crew had acted inappropriately. She couldn't help me get a flight, but she could print out all my documentation, including the incident report, my original ticket, and the notes from Patricia Dunn's decision to remove me. I accepted everything gratefully and asked if she knew a good lawyer who handled airline discrimination cases. She shook her head but said I should contact the Department of Transportation and possibly the FAA since they regulated disability accommodations on aircraft. My blood sugar had come down to 234 mg/dL by the time I left the airport, still higher than ideal but no longer in the danger zone. I felt physically drained and emotionally devastated as I took a rideshare back to my apartment in Seattle. I'd used up my 2 vacation days, I was going to miss my sister's wedding, and I'd been treated like a criminal for the crime of having a chronic illness. I spent the rest of the day researching airline passenger rights and disability discrimination laws. What I found made my blood boil. The Air Carrier Access Act explicitly prohibited airlines from discriminating against passengers with disabilities, and that included refusing to accommodate medical devices necessary for managing chronic conditions. The FAA regulations I'd tried to show Brittany clearly stated that portable electronic medical devices like continuous glucose monitors and insulin pumps were exempt from the electronics ban during takeoff and landing. Coastal Airways had violated federal law by removing me from that flight. I filed a complaint with the Department of Transportation's Aviation Consumer Protection Division that evening, detailing everything that had happened and attaching all the documentation Angela had given me. I also filed complaints with the FAA and contacted a disability rights organization called the Airline Passenger Rights Coalition. They connected me with an attorney named Thomas Whitmore, who specialized in airline discrimination cases and had successfully sued major carriers for disability rights violations. I called his office the next morning and got an appointment for the following week. In the meantime, I had to watch my sister's wedding via video call from my apartment, seeing her walk down the aisle in her beautiful white dress while I sat alone in my living room in sweatpants feeling like I'd failed her. The wedding was beautiful. Rachel looked radiant, and her husband James seemed like a genuinely good guy. But every time someone asked Rachel where I was, and she had to explain that the airline had removed me from my flight, I felt the guilt and anger twist in my stomach. My parents were furious on my behalf, and my dad, a retired attorney himself, encouraged me to pursue legal action aggressively. After the ceremony, Rachel called me privately and cried about how much she'd missed having me there. She said it didn't feel right celebrating without her big brother. I promised her I was going to make Coastal Airways pay for what they'd done, not just to me, but to ensure it didn't happen to other diabetic passengers in the future. The meeting with Thomas Whitmore was enlightening and infuriating in equal measure. He was in his mid-40s with graying hair and an office full of framed newspaper articles about his previous cases. He'd successfully sued airlines for removing passengers with service dogs, for refusing to accommodate wheelchair users, and for discriminating against travelers with invisible disabilities. He read through my documentation and said I had one of the strongest cases he'd seen in his 15-year career. The combination of clear federal law violations, documented medical emergency, detailed incident reports, and quantifiable damages including the missed wedding made this what he called a slam dunk case. He explained that we could sue for compensatory damages covering my ticket cost, medical expenses, and the value of missing an irreplaceable family event. Plus, punitive damages meant to punish Coastal Airways for their egregious conduct and deter future violations. Thomas filed the lawsuit 3 weeks later in federal court, alleging violations of the Air Carrier Access Act, disability discrimination, emotional distress, and negligence. We were suing for $500,000 in compensatory and punitive damages. Coastal Airways responded with a predictable denial of all allegations, claiming their crew had acted appropriately to maintain safety and that I had been removed for refusing to comply with lawful crew instructions, not because of my disability. Their legal team, led by a corporate defense attorney named Victoria Ashford, filed a motion to dismiss claiming we had no valid cause of action. Thomas opposed the motion, with a detailed brief citing the specific federal regulations Coastal Airways had violated, and including expert testimony from an endocrinologist named Dr. Patricia Lawrence, who explained the serious medical risks of preventing a diabetic passenger from using their monitoring equipment and insulin. The judge, a stern woman named Judith Blackwell, who'd been on the federal bench for 23 years, denied Coastal Airways' motion to dismiss and ordered the case to proceed to discovery. This meant both sides could request documents and depositions from the other party. Thomas immediately subpoenaed all of Coastal Airways' training materials related to medical devices and disability accommodations, all incident reports involving diabetic passengers over the past 5 years, and all communications between the flight crew and supervisors regarding my removal. What we found during discovery was even worse than I'd imagined. Coastal Airways had received 17 previous complaints about flight attendants confiscating or demanding removal of continuous glucose monitors over the past 3 years. In every single case, the airline had settled quietly out of court with confidentiality agreements that prevented passengers from speaking publicly about their experiences. Even more damning, the training materials showed that Coastal Airways' flight attendant manual incorrectly stated that all electronic devices must be turned off during takeoff and landing with no exceptions. The medical device exemption that was clearly outlined in FAA regulations was simply absent from their training materials. This meant Brittany and the other flight attendants weren't necessarily being malicious, they were following inadequate training that put diabetic passengers at serious risk. The depositions were scheduled for 6 months after we filed the lawsuit. I gave my deposition first, spending 4 hours answering questions from Victoria Ashford about my medical history, my experience on the flight, and the impact of missing my sister's wedding. She tried to make it sound like I was exaggerating the severity of a blood sugar of 445 mg/dL, but Dr. Lawrence's expert report thoroughly demolished that argument by explaining that levels above 400 mg/dL can cause diabetic ketoacidosis, which has a mortality rate of 2.5%, even with proper treatment. Brittany's deposition was illuminating. She admitted under oath that she'd never been trained on the FAA exemption for medical devices and that she'd simply followed what she understood to be airline policy requiring all electronics off during takeoff. She also admitted she hadn't asked me for any documentation of the medical necessity of my device before demanding I turn it off. When Thomas asked her if she understood that preventing a diabetic passenger from monitoring their blood sugar could be life-threatening, she got defensive and said she was just doing her job and following what she'd been taught in training. Dennis and Kimberly gave similar testimonies, both confirming they had no training on medical device exemptions, and both claiming they'd acted in good faith based on their understanding of the rules. Patricia Dunn's deposition was where things got really interesting. She admitted that she'd seen my FAA exemption documentation and had recognized that the flight crew had made an error, but she'd still decided to remove me from the flight because, in her words, the crew needs to maintain authority, and reversing their decision would undermine that authority in front of other passengers. Thomas asked her to clarify whether she was saying she removed a disabled passenger she knew had done nothing wrong in order to save face for flight attendants who'd violated federal law. She backtracked quickly, claiming she'd had concerns about my attitude and behavior, but the damage was done. She'd admitted on the record that she removed me from the flight, despite knowing I was legally entitled to use my medical device. The case gained some media attention after a diabetic advocacy group picked up the story. A reporter from the Seattle Times wrote an article about my lawsuit and the broader pattern of airlines mishandling medical devices. Other diabetic passengers started coming forward with their own stories of being harassed or removed from flights for using insulin pumps and glucose monitors. The Diabetes Coalition of America issued a statement calling on all airlines to improve their training and compliance with federal disability laws. Coastal Airways released a statement saying they took the safety and comfort of all passengers seriously and that they were reviewing their policies. It was corporate speak that meant nothing, but at least people were paying attention. Settlement discussions began 8 months after I filed the lawsuit. Coastal Airways Insurance Company wanted to settle for $75,000 with a confidentiality agreement. Thomas advised me to reject it, saying the case was worth far more given the clear liability and the pattern of similar incidents. We countered with a demand for $450,000 and mandatory policy changes, including updated training for all flight attendants on medical device regulations and a formal apology. Victoria Ashford said her client would never agree to policy changes as part of a settlement because that would be admitting wrongdoing. Thomas said that was fine, we'd be happy to go to trial and let a jury decide whether Coastal Airways should pay even more for their conduct. The second settlement offer came 2 weeks before the scheduled trial date. $275,000, no confidentiality agreement, but still no admission of wrongdoing or policy changes. I was tempted to accept it just to be done with the whole nightmare, but Thomas convinced me to hold firm. He said we had leverage because Coastal Airways didn't want the bad publicity of a trial where their systematic violations of disability law would be exposed in detail. Rachel called me during this period and said she'd been following the case and was proud of me for fighting back. She said it had turned out to be a good thing that I wasn't at the wedding in person, because now I was potentially helping thousands of diabetic passengers who might face similar situations. It was a generous way to reframe my absence, and I appreciated her trying to find meaning in what had happened. The trial was scheduled to begin on a Monday morning in November. Thomas had prepared extensively, lining up expert witnesses including Dr. Lawrence the endocrinologist, a former FAA official named Robert Keene, who could testify about the medical device regulations, and even Officer Taylor, who'd witnessed my condition immediately after being removed from the plane. We also had character witnesses, including my sister and my parents, who could testify about the impact of missing the wedding. The jury pool was selected on Sunday, and Thomas said we'd gotten a good group of people who seemed sympathetic and engaged. But Sunday evening, Victoria Ashford called Thomas with a new settlement offer. $425,000, no confidentiality agreement, no admission of wrongdoing. But Coastal Airways would agree to update their flight attendant training materials to include the FAA medical device exemption and would institute a new review process for any passenger removal related to medical conditions. Thomas called me immediately and said this was as good as we were going to get without going to trial. The money was substantial. The policy changes would actually help other diabetic passengers, and we wouldn't have to spend the next week in court reliving the trauma. I asked if we could negotiate one more thing, a written apology from Coastal Airways acknowledging they'd mishandled the situation. Victoria said her client would agree to a private letter of apology, but not a public statement. I accepted. The settlement was finalized the next morning, just hours before we would have started jury selection. I signed the papers in Thomas's office and felt a complicated mix of relief and disappointment. Relief that the ordeal was over, disappointment that Coastal Airways got to avoid public accountability with no admission they'd done anything wrong. The $425,000 settlement came through 6 weeks later, less Thomas's contingency fee of 33% and some additional legal costs, leaving me with approximately $270,000. It was more money than I'd ever had in my life, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like compensation for something that should never have happened. I used some of it to pay off my student loans, some to create an emergency fund, and I donated $25,000 to the Diabetes Coalition of America to fund advocacy work around airline accessibility. Rachel and James had postponed their honeymoon because of the stress surrounding the wedding, so I paid for them to spend 2 weeks in Italy as a combination wedding gift and apology for missing their celebration. Rachel cried when I told her and said I didn't need to apologize, that none of it was my fault, but I did it anyway. The policy changes at Coastal Airways took effect 3 months after the settlement. All flight attendants received updated training materials that explicitly covered the FAA exemption for medical devices and included specific examples of continuous glucose monitors and insulin pumps. The airline also implemented a new protocol requiring supervisors to consult with a medical professional before removing any passenger for reasons related to a disability or medical condition. Thomas sent me a copy of the new training manual, and I read through it with a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't perfect, but it was substantially better than what had been in place when Brittany had confiscated my monitor. The private letter of apology from Coastal Airways arrived around the same time. It was written on corporate letterhead and signed by the Vice President of Customer Relations. The language was carefully crafted to avoid any admission of legal liability, but it did acknowledge that I'd experienced an unfortunate situation and that the airline was committed to better serving passengers with disabilities in the future. I never flew Coastal Airways again, but I did fly frequently for work over the following year. Every time I boarded a plane with my glucose monitor and insulin pump, I felt a spike of anxiety remembering that day when Brittany had demanded I turn off my life-saving medical device. But I also felt more prepared to advocate for myself. I always carried printed copies of the FAA regulations, my doctor's letter explaining my medical needs, and Officer Taylor's card with the incident report number just in case. I never needed them. Every other airline I flew with either already knew about the medical device exemption or quickly looked it up when I proactively mentioned it during boarding. The difference between Coastal Airways' systematic failure and the competent professionalism of other carriers was stark. Rachel had her first baby 2 years after the wedding, a little girl named Emma. Wait, I can't use Emma. A little girl named Sophie. I flew to Phoenix without incident to meet my niece and spent a week helping Rachel and James adjust to parenthood. During one late-night feeding session while Rachel was recovering from childbirth, we talked about the lawsuit and everything that had happened. She said she'd been angry on my behalf for months after the wedding, furious that Coastal Airways had treated me so badly and that I'd missed one of the most important days of her life. But she also said the policy changes I'd forced the airline to implement had probably prevented other diabetic passengers from going through similar ordeals, and that meant something significant. She asked if I felt like justice had been served. I thought about it for a long time before answering. Justice would have been Coastal Airways being held publicly accountable for systematic violations of disability law. Justice would have been meaningful consequences for Patricia Dunn, who'd admitted removing me from a flight despite knowing I'd done nothing wrong. Justice would have been me sitting in the front row watching Rachel walk down the aisle instead of watching on a grainy video call from 1,000 miles away. But what I got was $270,000 and policy changes that might protect other diabetic passengers from being removed from flights for using their medical equipment. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was something. And in a system where corporations usually face no consequences for harming individuals, maybe that had to be enough. I still think about that day sometimes. usually when I'm boarding a plane and the flight attendants are doing their safety demonstration. I think about how quickly a routine situation can become a nightmare when the people in authority either don't know the rules or don't care enough to follow them. I think about Brittany standing in the aisle, demanding I turn off my glucose monitor while it beeped warnings that my blood sugar was climbing to life-threatening levels. I think about Patricia Dunn admitting she'd removed me from the flight to save face for her crew even though she knew they'd made a mistake. I think about sitting in my apartment watching my sister get married without me because an airline valued their crew's authority over my health and my rights as a passenger with a disability. And I think about how many other diabetic passengers had gone through similar experiences before me, silenced by confidentiality agreements that let Coastal Airways continue the same harmful practices. But I also think about the training manual changes and the new review protocols for medical removals. I think about Dr. Lawrence's expert testimony explaining why access to continuous glucose monitoring isn't a luxury, but a medical necessity. I think about Officer Taylor, who treated me with kindness when I was at my lowest point and encouraged me to document everything. I think about Thomas Whitmore, who took my case and fought for not just compensation but actual policy changes. And I think about Rachel telling me that missing her wedding had turned into something meaningful because it led to changes that would help other people. The flight attendant took my medical device and said all electronics must be off during takeoff. She was wrong, and proving it cost me one of the most important days of my sister's life. But it also forced an airline to change policies that had been harming diabetic passengers for years. That's not the justice I wanted, but it's the justice I got. 3 years later, I received an email from a woman named Catherine Brooks, who'd been removed from a Coastal Airways flight for using her insulin pump. But unlike what happened to me, the flight attendants had received the updated training and recognized that her pump was a medical device exempt from electronics restrictions. When a supervisor questioned the flight attendant's decision to allow the device, the new review protocol meant they consulted with the airline's medical director before taking any action. Catherine wasn't removed from her flight. She made it to her destination safely and arrived with her blood sugar in normal range because she'd been able to use her medical equipment as needed. She'd somehow found out about my lawsuit and the settlement and wanted to thank me for fighting back. She said that until she'd read about my case, she hadn't known she had rights, or that airlines were required to accommodate medical devices. My advocacy had directly led to her smooth flight experience. Reading Catherine's email, I finally felt something like closure. The lawsuit, the settlement, the missed wedding, all of it had seemed like such a personal failure at the time. But it had created real change that protected real people from going through what I'd experienced. Brittany probably still works as a flight attendant somewhere, maybe even still at Coastal Airways for all I know. Patricia Dunn likely continued making decisions about passenger removals, though hopefully with better judgment after my case. Coastal Airways avoided public accountability and got to continue operating without any admission of wrongdoing. Those things still bothered me when I thought about them. But Catherine and however many other diabetic passengers benefited from the policy changes didn't have to experience the terror of being separated from their medical equipment at 30,000 feet. They didn't have to miss their sisters' weddings or their children's births or business meetings or family funerals because a poorly trained crew member didn't understand federal disability law. The monitor said dangerously high, seek medical attention. The flight attendant took it anyway. And in fighting back against that casual cruelty, I'd changed something bigger than just my own case. Not perfect justice, but something real, something that mattered. And 4 years later, knowing that other diabetic passengers were flying safely because of training materials that resulted from my lawsuit, I could finally say it had been worth it. If you made it this far, hit like, you've earned it.